It's a subject I'm not supposed to discuss, the 2020 election. And I'm going to discuss some conspiracies that took place in the 2020 election, not with voting machines, not even with ballot counting, just conspiracies that took place, dark money, billionaires, the Democrat Party, corporatists, and others. And if we don't address this, the next election for president in 2024 is going to wind up the same way. Now, first there was a piece in Time magazine some time ago, last February, the secret history of the shadow campaign that saved the 2020 election. Saved it for whom? Well, the Democrats and Joe Biden. So to lay the foundation here, it says in part, Trump said on December 2nd, within days after the election, we witnessed an orchestrated effort to anoint the winner, even while many key states were still being counted. Well, he wasn't wrong about that, ladies and gentlemen. Later in the piece, it says their work, whose work? Left-wing groups, corporatists, Democrat Party operatives, and of course the media. Their work touched every aspect of the election. They got states to change voting systems and laws, helped secure hundreds of millions in public and private funding. They fended off voter suppression lawsuits, their word, recruited armies of poll workers, and got millions of people to vote by mail for the first time. They successfully pressured social media companies to take a harder line against disinformation and use data-driven strategies to fight viral smears. You can see how partisan it is. I'm reading this to you so you can recall what was done. They executed national public awareness campaigns that helped Americans understand how the vote count would unfold over days or weeks, preventing Trump's conspiracy theories and false claims of victory from getting more traction. Conspiracy theories? This whole article is about a conspiracy theory. After Election Day, they monitored every pressure point to ensure that Trump could not overturn the result. The untold story of the election is the thousands of people of both parties who accomplished the triumph of American democracy at its very foundation, says Norm Eisen, a prominent lawyer and, of course, former Obama administration official who recruited Republicans, a.k.a. never-Trumpers, and Democrats to the board of the Voter Protection Program. That's number one. Number two, the New York Post. Mark Zuckerberg spent $419 million on nonprofits ahead of the 2020 election and got out the Democrat vote. During the 2020 election, Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg spent hundreds of millions of dollars to turn out likely key Democratic voters. But this wasn't traditional political spending. He funded a targeted private takeover of government election operations by normally nonpartisan but demonstrably ideological nonprofit organizations. Analysis conducted by our team, New York Post says, demonstrates this money significantly increased Joe Biden's vote margin in key swing states. In places like Georgia, where Biden won by 12,000 votes, and Arizona, where he won by 10,000. The spending likely put him over the top. This unprecedented merger of public election offices with private resources and personnel is an acute threat to our republic and should be the focus of electoral reform efforts moving forward. Now, how did he do this? The Center for Technology and Civic Life and the Center for Election Innovation and Research passed a staggering $419.5 million of Zuckerberg's money into local government election offices, and it came with strings attached. Every CTCL and CEIR grant spelled out in grant detail the conditions under which the grant money was to be used. Big CTCL and CEIR money had nothing to do with traditional campaign financing, lobbying, or other expenses that are related to increasingly expensive modern elections. It had to do with financing the infiltration of election offices at the city and county level by left-wing activists and using those offices as a platform to implement preferred administrative practices, voting methods, and data sharing agreements, as well as to launch intensive outreach campaigns in areas heavy with Democratic voters. For instance, CTCL, CEIR funded self-described vote navigators in Wisconsin to assist voters, potentially at their front doors, to answer questions, assist in ballot curing, and witness absentee ballot signatures. A temporary staffing agency affiliated with Stacey Abrams called Happy Faces, counting the votes amid the election night chaos in Fulton County, Georgia. CTCL demanded the promotion of universal mail-in voting through suspending election laws. extending deadlines that favored mail-in over in-person voting, greatly expanding opportunities for, quote, ballot curing, unquote, expensive bulk mailings and other lavish community outreach, quote unquote, programs that were directed by private activists. CTCL drove the proliferation of unmonitored private drop boxes, which created major chain of custody issues and opportunities for novel forms of mail-in ballot electioneering, allowed for the submission of numerous questionable post-election day ballots, and created opportunities for illegal ballot harvesting. CTCL greatly increased funding for temporary staffing and poll workers, which supported the infiltration of election offices by paid Democratic Party activists, coordinated through a complex web of left-leaning nonprofit organizations, social media platforms, and social media election influencers. Funding and managing elections has always been a government function, not a private one, and for good reason, they write. Private organizations are not subject to the rules for public employees and institutions. They are not required to hold public hearings, cannot be monitored via open records requests and other mechanisms of administrative and financial transparency, are not subject to the normal checks and balances of the governmental process, and are not accountable to the voters if the public disapproves of their actions. The practical effect of these massive, privately manipulated election office funding disparities was to create a shadow election system with a built-in structural bias that systematically favored Democratic voters over Republican voters. The massive influx of funds essentially created a high-powered, concierge-like get-out-the-vote effort for Biden that took place inside the election system rather than attempting to influence it from the outside. William Doyle, Ph.D., and he's an election and research expert. But there's more. Over at Breitbart, top Democrat lawyer uses dark money network to fund progressive lawsuits. Remember all the lawsuits brought between 2016 and 2020 to change the rules in the states to accommodate the Democrats? Top Democrat attorney Mark Elias has been using a dark money network to fund lawsuits geared toward advocating progressive causes, from fighting voter ID laws to enshrining universal mail-in voting, according to a watchdog group, Americans for Public Trust. Elias, who previously helped push the Russia collusion hoax after serving as Hillary Clinton's top campaign lawyer, recently parted ways from Perkins Coie law firm to start the Elias Law Group, a firm dedicated to advancing the Democrat Party's agenda. But he worked within the Perkins Coie law firm during the lead-up and during the last election. Prior to the formation of his new firm, Elias formed extensive ties with a dark money network headed by Arabella Advisors, a company that manages several nonprofits: Hopewell Fund, the 1630 Fund, the New Venture Fund, and the Woodward Fund. According to Fox News, in July 2020, Elias created the Democracy Docket Legal Fund, which was a fiscally sponsored project of the Hopewell Fund. So you have this mothership, the Arabella Advisors Fund. Then you have these second-tier funds with the connections like this. And money moves between the funds. And they're set up, why? Because legally, depending on what fund spends the money, you can't get transparency. Wealthy Democratic donors use these funds to pour cash in the dozens of initiatives that fall under Arabella's umbrella. According to the network's most recent tax forms, the four funds combined to haul in $715 million in cash from secret donors in 2019 alone. That cash, for the most part, went to fund lawsuits to try and promote the Democrat Party, position the Democrat Party, defeat the Republican Party, and specifically Donald Trump. The group also pushes money to outside organizations that do not fall under its auspices. In addition to the Democracy Docket LLC, attorney Elias created the Democracy Docket Action Fund to raise money for voting rights lawsuits. The New York Times reported last year, according to an Act Blue donation page, another left-wing fund, the Action Fund is a project of the North Fund, which also boasts connections to the Arabella Advisors. So all these funds are set up. All these funds are set up. So multi-billionaires and millionaires can pour their money into these organizations. There's no transparency, which is why they call it dark funds. So we, the American people, have no idea what's taking place. And these funds were set up by Democrats, by the Democrat Party. These funds were used by this guy, Mark Elias, to bring lawsuits brought all over the country in all 50 states, hundreds of lawsuits, targeting the election laws to make it easier, not for people to vote, but for the Democrat Party to enshrine the voting systems that they wanted. That's what that's all about. And in Pennsylvania alone, 2 serious federal constitutional cases were brought in connection with Article 2, Section 1, Clause 2, to challenge what had been done in Pennsylvania and the rogue Supreme Court there, which changed the voting system in the last days of the election against the will of the Republican state legislature. That violates the federal Constitution. State legislatures determine election procedures for appointing electors under Article 2, Section 1, Clause 2. Why am I bringing this all up? Because Donald Trump has a point. You may not agree with every point, and depending on the state, there may be evidence, there may not be evidence. But the idea that we can't talk about what took place in the last election, so the Democrats can now lay the foundation in the 2024 election to do the same thing and double what they're doing, is unacceptable. Dark money, front groups, hundreds of millions of dollars raised, changing the voting systems to accommodate the Democrat Party and the Democrat nominee, and can affect, of course, Senate races and House races, too. This is something that needs to be investigated. Now, it's not going to be investigated by Biden and his administration. They benefited from it. It's not going to be investigated by the rogue attorney general, because he supports everything that's being done. And apparently, it's not going to be investigated by the Democrat House or the Democrat Senate. The House is off on January 6th on a phony insurrection. Ladies and gentlemen, our election system is, in fact, under attack. And it's under attack by very, very wealthy people, in combination with radical left-wing Democrat Party organizations. There is no getting around it. There is no question about it. Dark money, all this money flowing into the coffers, organizations that don't have to report who's giving what to whom, a combination of the corporatists and the left-wing groups, and it goes on and on and on. And they are there today, and they are plotting right now. And of course, you're not allowed to talk about this because the media has said this is all conspiracy stuff. And the media has said, well, 66 lawsuits were brought in, and you couldn't win a single one. This has nothing to do with bringing lawsuits. This has everything to do with changing the voting system so we have a corrupt, fraudulent voting system. And you rhinos out there, and you Bushies out there, and you Cheneyites out there, and you Never Trumpers out there, you've contributed to this. You have contributed to this. Nobody's trying to reverse anything. We want the light shed on what took place, and we want to make sure it never happens again. So while you're chasing shiny objects set up by the Democrat Party, while you're chasing issues that are not going to affect the next election, but are attacking Trump even while he's a private citizen, this is going on, ladies and gentlemen, under the radar and in the shadows. I'll be right back.